Section 1 of The Return of the Exiles and the West African Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Return of the Exiles and the West African Church. A lecture delivered at the Breadfruit Schoolhouse, Lagos, West Africa, January 2nd, 1891, by Edward Wilmot Blyden. Part 1 of Lecture. Request for publication. The following resolution, moved by Honourable and Reverend James Johnson, M.A., seconded by Nash H. Williams, Esquire, Barrister at Law, and put to the meeting by the Chairman, His Excellency Sir Alfred Maloney, KCMG, was carried by acclamation, that the thanks of this meeting be cordially rendered to Dr. Edward W. Blyden for his able, interesting, and instructive lecture, and that he be requested to furnish a copy of the same for publication. Lecture. It affords me great pleasure to stand before you tonight to greet for the first time a Lagos audience, and, if your Excellency will permit me to say so, I feel it a special privilege to have come to this settlement during your administration and while you are stimulating an enterprise upon which alone, among many agencies, I believe that the rapid regeneration and permanent prosperity of Africa depend. I mean the repatriation of the exiles from the Western Hemisphere. And it is a source of further gratification to me to know that in your efforts in this direction, you are supported by a band of officials, foreign and native, who share in your sagacious appreciation of that great work, and do everything to render efficient cooperation in all the statesmanlike schemes for the good of the country and the people which you are endeavouring to carry out. As I intimated a few days ago, note, see Appendix, to a committee of gentlemen whom I had the honour to receive, I look upon Lagos as one of the most hopeful spots in West Africa. Notwithstanding all I had heard of the developments there, I was taken by most exhilarating surprise when I entered the lagoon and witnessed the evidences of material growth before me, the result of only 30 years' peaceful and judicious administration. As I gazed with something like rapture at the scene, I was reminded of some of the cities in the southern states of America which I visited a year ago, especially Charleston, South Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida. Though the advantage seemed to me far and away in favour of Lagos, considering the remote origins of the date of that city compared to that of this quote-unquote Liverpool of West Africa, and when I landed and saw the inhabitants, the comparison was still suggested by the large population of unmixed Africans. The cities of Charleston and Jacksonville, from the colour of the people who throng their streets, may be called African cities in America, and from its business-like appearance, as well as the novelty of everything, the newness of its improvements, Lagos might be called an American city in Africa. But I was very much struck by the difference in the general bearing of the people here. They resembled their brethren across the sea in nothing but their colour. While it is true that the only original thing produced in the southern states, that which may be said to be most distinctly American, is the music of the Exiles, still there is, in spite of their inexhaustible melody, an evident air of depression and unrest about them, a sullen acquiescence in their surroundings. Although they have charmed the ears and melted the hearts of nobles and crowned heads in Europe by their unparalleled gift of song, yet for them the key note of their music is degradation and despair. They are exiles, kept in perpetual dread, carrying about with them the marks of their besetting and obtrusive infirmities. Their constant and pervading feeling is that the character in Wordsworth, quote, "My apprehensions come in crowds. I dread the rustling of the grass. The very shadow of the clouds have power to shake me as they pass. I question things and do not find one that will answer to my mind, and all the world appears unkind." On the other hand, the visitor to Lagos sees in the people, in the openness of their countenance, the brightness of their eyes, the freedom of their movement, a fullness of life. We see men and women and children living in the joys of home. And there is not a breathing of the common wind that blows which does not inspire them with the love of that home. The trees and the clouds, the sluggish rivers, the quiet waters of the lagoon, the boisterous and perilous bar are all their own. And for the exiles who have returned, Lagos has all the elements of a genuine patriotism. The natural beauty and fertility of the country, the increasing development of its material resources, the noble names among their ancestors, the lives of kings and warriors of their own blood, of whom they have heard, the great deeds these heroes have performed, the legendary and historical songs and ancient dances of the tribes, all become inspirations. No suspicion haunts them that the country will ever be taken from them. They rest not only in the conviction, but in the consciousness that it is theirs by divine right, preserved for them by divine interposition. However, for temporary purposes, and in small localities, it may be ruled by foreigners. Quote, "Despite of every yoke she bears, this land of glory still is theirs." Unquote. I have visited the quarter of the Brazilian repatriates, and I have been deeply impressed by the results of their labours and enterprise under the impulse of the spirit of freedom. They are drinking in the healing and invigorating influences of their new surroundings. They are taking advantage of the unquestionable advantages they enjoy in the land of their fathers. The use of their own language, which the people of Lagos have not only retained, but are sedulously cultivating, is another element of joy, of safety, and of strength. In their religious gatherings, in their secular meetings, the use of their mother tongue must give, for the majority, clearness, precision, and vigour to their expressions, and carry force to the mind of the hearer, of which the English language, even in its simplest form, must always be shorn. But we must remember that it has not always been so in Lagos. Less than 50 years ago, the place now occupied by this beautiful settlement was the scene of all the horrors which have ever marked the track of the piratical monsters who disgraced humanity by their atrocious deeds. Good government was unknown and utterly impossible under the fiendish proceedings of those enemies of the human race who infested the coast. Agriculture and honest trade were constantly interrupted by raiding from within and rapine from without. Spoliation and bloodshed was the order of the day. What a change has been wrought even within the short life of a generation. English Christianity and philanthropy, as well as English statesmanship and commercial enterprise, have brought about the present promising state of things. And wherever England holds sway on this coast, and indeed where she does not hold sway, the prayer of the natives constantly is, quote unquote, God save the Queen. Africa's relation to the rest of the world has always been strange and peculiar. Her people have not mingled with the rest of mankind except to render service, to give help in times of emergency, while there seems to have hung over the country the unalterable decree of prohibition against the incursion of foreigners. The nations of antiquity all tried their hands. Phoenicia, Greece, Carthage, Rome. The Mediterranean nations vied with each other in endeavours to occupy the country, but they could hold only the northern margin and for only brief periods. As we read the providential purpose in the events of history, past and contemporary, we see that God's plan is against the extensive occupation of this continent by foreigners. This the statesmen of antiquity found out after repeated and disastrous failures. Caesar Augustus, during whose reign Rome was mistress of the world, whose decree that all the world should be taxed, brought about the fulfillment of a wonderful prophecy which Christendom has recently been celebrating, and who, like the poets of his day, believed in the destiny of Rome to sway universal empire, yet left earnest counsel and direction in his will that the Romans should never invade Africa. And England, which in her colonizing genius and in the extent of her empire is the modern antitype of Rome, has until very lately been acting in the spirit of the advice of Augustus. She has been unwilling to take up lands in the vast equatorial regions of this country, but recently she has been forced to depart from her policy by the intermeddling activity of others, whose enterprises, however, whatever promise they may now present, must give way to the inexorable destiny which guards the continent. Lord Salisbury, in his speech in the Guildhall a few weeks ago, November 9th, 1890, informed the world that England's departure from her traditional policy with regards to Africa was an intervention to prevent such an intervention as would interfere with the interests of Great Britain and therefore with the interests of civilization and humanity. His lordship vindicated his desire to acquire, quote unquote, large stretches of African territory and to place them under the British flag by reference to the important fact that, quote unquote, every bit of the world's surface that is not under the British flag is a country which may be, and probably will be, closed to England by a hostile tariff. If this had been thought of 30 years ago, Sierra Leone would not now be hampered on the north in its commercial growth. And considering how much England has done to open up that region, the whole of the territory between the Niger and the Atlantic, with the exception of small strips, would now be under British rule. The ancients, who were at the beginning of things, saw many truths which, forgotten in the course of time, men are only now recovering. The Greeks looked upon the interior of Africa as a place for the abode of the gods, not for ordinary men. They made their divinities leave the summits of Olympus and betake themselves annually to the country of the Ethiopians. It is now certain that 40 centuries ago Homer knew of those mountain kings with their mantle of cloud and snow, Ruwenzori and Kilimanjaro. Perhaps it was upon the inaccessible summits of these African Alps that they planted the seat of the gods. And what is significant is that not only could the great men of antiquity, warriors and kings and statesmen, make no impression upon Africa, but even their gods failed to leave any mark. No writer has told us that these periodical visits left any trace of their having occurred. To Ethiopia came Jupiter with his thunderbolts, Juno with her arts and sciences, Apollo with his brightness and music, Venus with her beauty and love, Mars with his war, the whole Olympian circle, but they produced no impression upon the country. At least even the fertile imagination of their worshippers could invent none. Africa has always resisted and thrown off foreign influences because those influences, even of the highest character, have come modified with elements injurious to the country. Jupiter came with his incest and adultery, Saturn with his cannibalism, Venus with her profligacy, Apollo with his cruelty, Mars with his sanguinary disposition. Europe then, even in the days of her heathenism, though the very best of her productions, according to her highest conceptions, were in constant intercourse with Africa, had no influence upon her. There was nothing in the mythology of Greece or Rome, in the military prowess of Cambyses or Alexandria, in the commercial greed and enterprise of Carthage, to make any permanent impression upon the continent. Now, let us see whether in the days of her Christianity she has been able to do any permanent work. Everybody knows the fate of the Christian church established in North Africa. This church had possession of 3,000 towns and villages and 560 episcopal sees, the church that produced Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine. After flourishing for centuries, it was driven out by the Saracens, who have now held the place formerly occupied by Christians for more than 1,000 years. France holds the government of portions of North Africa, but the people are Mohammedans, who enforce the laws of their religion with the assistance or connivance of their foreign rulers. In modern times, since the revival of the missionary spirit, Christian missions have striven to penetrate the continent, but they have had to contend and are still contending with insuperable difficulties. Very little has been effected upon the Aborigines away from European settlements, and indeed it may be stated that the world has yet to witness the example of a single community, large or small, of free and independent Negroes in the interior who have embraced Christianity as brought to them from Europe. It would seem that neither the climate nor the circumstances of the people will admit of the introduction of Christianity into this country by members of a foreign race. Experience everywhere shows the extreme difficulty and impossibility of the enterprise. As examples of the uniform experience of missionary operations in Africa and of the general effect of the climate, even in the most healthy regions, I will quote first from Professor Drummond's book on tropical Africa, and then from Mr. Stanley's recent book, In Darkest Africa. 2 missionary regions were visited by Mr. Drummond. The first he thus describes, quote, "Our next stoppage was to pay another homage. Truly this is a tragic region, at another white man's grave. A few years ago, Bishop Mackenzie and some other missionaries were sent to Africa by the English universities with instructions to try to establish a mission in the footsteps of Livingstone. They came here. The climate overpowered them. One by one they sickened and died. With the death of the bishop himself, the site was abandoned, and the few survivors returned home. Among the hippopotamus-trampled reeds, on the banks of the Shire, under a rough iron cross, lies the first of 3 brave bishops who have already made their graves in equatorial Africa." End quote. The second missionary station on the shore of the upland lake tells a similar tale. Quote, "A neat path through a small garden led up to the settlement, and I approached the largest house and entered. It was the Livingstonia manse, the head missionary's house. It was spotlessly clean. English furniture was in the room, a medicine chest, familiar-looking dishes were in the cupboards, books lying about, but there was no missionary in it. I went to the next house. It was a school. The benches were there, and the blackboard, but there were no scholars, and no teacher. I passed to the next. It was the blacksmith shop. There were the tools and anvil, but there was no blacksmith. And so on to the next, and the next, all in perfect order, and all empty. Then a native approached and led me a few yards into the forest, and there, among the mimosa trees, under a huge granite mountain, were 4 or 5 graves. These were the missionaries. I spent a day or 2 in the solemn shadow of that deserted manse. It is one of the loveliest spots in the world, and it was hard to believe, sitting under the tamarind trees by the quiet lake shore, that the pestilence which wasteth at midnight had made this beautiful spot its home. 150 miles north, on the same lake coast, the remnant of the missionaries have begun their task again, and there, slowly, against fearful odds, they are carrying on their work." End quote. Notice again the following, quote, "Malarial fever is the one sad certainty which every African traveller must face. For months he may escape, but its finger is upon him, and well for him if he has a friend near when it finally overtakes him. It is preceded for weeks, or even for a month or 2, by unaccountable irritability, depression, and weariness. This goes on day after day till the crash comes. First cold and pain, then heat and pain, then every kind of pain and every degree of heat, then delirium, then the life and death struggle. He rises, if he does rise, a shadow, and slowly accumulates strength for the next attack, which he knows too well will not disappoint him. No one has ever yet got to the bottom of African fever. Its geographical distribution is still unmapped, but generally it prevails over the whole east and west coasts within the tropical limit, along all the river courses, on the shores of the inland lakes, and in all low-lying and marshy districts. The higher plateaux, presumably, are comparatively free from it, but in order to reach these, malarious districts of greater or smaller area have to be traversed. There the system becomes saturated with fever, which often develops long after the infected region is left behind. The really appalling mortality of Europeans is a fact with which all who have any idea of casting in their lot with Africa should seriously reckon. None but those who have been on the spot or have followed closely the inner history of African exploration and missionary work can appreciate the gravity of the situation. The malaria spares no man. The strong falls as the weak. No number of precautions can provide against it. No kind of care can do more than make the attacks less frequent. No prediction can be made beforehand as to which regions are haunted by it and which are safe. It is not the least ghastly feature of this invisible plague that the only known scientific test for it at present is a human life. That test has been applied in the Congo region already with a recklessness which the sober judgment can only characterize as criminal. It is a small matter that men should throw away their lives in hundreds, if needs be, for a holy cause, but it is not a small matter that man after man, in long and in fatal succession, should seek to overleap what is plainly a barrier of nature. And science has a duty in pointing out that no devotion or enthusiasm can give any man a charmed life, and that those who work for the highest ends will best attain them in humble obedience to the common laws. Transcendentally, this may be denied. The warning finger may be despised as the hand of the coward and the profane. But the fact remains, the fact of an awful chain of English graves stretching across Africa." End quote. Mr. Stanley's experience on the upland plains is not unlike that of Mr. Drummond. At pages 31 to 32, Volume 2 of Darkest Africa, he summarises his own experience. Quote, "On the plateau of Kavali and Undusuma, Messrs. Jefferson, Park and myself were successively prostrated fever, and the average level of the land was 4,500 feet above the sea. On descending to the Nyanza Plain, 2,500 feet lower, we were again laid up with fierce attacks. At Banana Point, which is at sea level, ague is only too common. At Boma, 80 feet higher, the ague is more common still. At Vivi, there were more cases than elsewhere, and the station was about 250 feet higher than Boma, and not a swamp near it. At Stanley Pool, about 1,100 feet above sea level, fever of a pernicious form was prevalent. While descending the Congo with the wind astern, we were unusually exempted from ague, but descending the upper Congo, facing the wind, we were smitten with most severe forms of it." End quote. Mr. Stanley concludes his reference to the Central African climate thus, quote, "Therefore it is proved that from 0 to 5,000 feet above the sea, there is no immunity from fever and ague. that over 40 miles of lake water between a camp and the other shore are no positive protection, that 1,000 miles of river course may serve as a flue to convey malaria in a concentrated form, that if there is a thick screen of primeval forest or a grove of plantains between the dwelling place and a large clearing or open country, there is only danger of the local malaria around the dwelling, which might be rendered harmless by the slightest attention to the system. But in the open country neither a house nor a tent is a sufficient protection, since the air enters by the doors of the house and under the flaps and through the ventilators to poison the inmates." End quote. With regard to the general effect of missionary work in this country, we cannot shut our eyes to the facts all around us. The native missionaries on the Niger have been recently censored for not achieving greater spiritual results under what must be regarded as impossible circumstances. The success of Christianity in apostolic times cannot be taken as a standard by which to judge of its progress in unevangelized lands at the present day. Primitive Christianity had this negative advantage that it was not theoretically presented and practically misrepresented at the same time. The apostles were not confronted on mission ground by their own countrymen of the same creed, doing openly and with indifference the very things they were commissioned to denounce. Modern commerce in its agents is a most potent drawback to all the ideas held up by the missionary. The natives have the example of the white and black missionary preaching, on the one hand, against the very things which the white Christian trader and the black Christian trader are practicing on the other. And the native cannot discriminate between the mere professor of religion and its possessor. Wherever it is thought desirable to plant a mission station as a centre of influence, there it is also considered profitable to establish the trading factory. And as, quote, "the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light," end quote, the trader becomes the controlling influence in that region, demanding and securing the services of the protégés of the mission, both male and female, as soon as they have acquired enough training to be serviceable for domestic and other purposes. The missionary is helpless to deal with this evil while, with tears in his eyes, he sees his work continually neutralized. The Church Missionary Intelligencer for April 1887 contained a most pathetic example of these trials, as given in a report by Bishop Crowther. Quote, "When we come," says the bishop, "to consider the want of suitable agents for the mission, either from Sierra Leone or Lagos, now keenly felt, it might appear as if no efforts had been made at the early part of the mission to train up promising youths from our schools who might be hereafter employed as teachers in due time. This was not at all neglected. Since the commencement of this mission, I have sent no less than 14 promising youths to Sierra Leone and Lagos grammar schools and training institutions to be educated, with the intention of employing them as teachers in course of time. But out of this number there are no more than 4 who remain to be thus employed. All the rest have resigned connection with the society and are now employed in the service of the national company as agents in the trading factories, or as stokers or engine drivers in their steamers, with the exception of one in our employ as a young carpenter." End quote. When Europe must send out her traders and her missionaries together, holding the present world in one hand and trying to point to the next with the other, missionary societies must not expect to realize those large results which their theory requires. Apostolic results must have apostolic circumstances. The exigencies of trade, and they are increasing daily, are imperious, and the demands of Christianity are equally so. Human nature being what it is, it needs no prophet to foretell which of the two will prevail. Where commerce is allowed a free hand to regulate its own operations, the agents of free trade feel that their first duty is to promote their business, which is purely worldly and secular. They cannot be expected to look after the spiritual or intellectual interests of their customers. To give support and currency to Christian ideas, as Europeans understand those ideas, it is thought by some that the European colony, with its administrative and executive machinery, is necessary. But the effect in favour of the religion of Christ at Sierra Leone, the oldest and the most important of the English colonies, is not considered encouraging even by missionary societies who deprecate the influence of that colony upon their missions away from the coast. Note: one of the charges against a native missionary in the Niger is that he introduced into his school a Sierra Leone boy. End note. Sierra Leone is not only a seaport, but a garrison town with its drinking saloons and other disreputable houses, the inevitable concomitants, it would appear, of civilization, but entirely unknown in the regions beyond. Christianity cannot be said to be in the ascendancy at the other colonies of Gambia, Cape Coast, or Lagos. In the efforts to spread Christianity in Africa, missionaries generally lose sight of the fact, if indeed they are aware of it, that no large number of Africans in freedom have as yet accepted Christianity. No African tribe, no African chief of influence has ever become Christian. In the early days of missionary operations in the Congo, some 4 centuries ago, the natives were baptized as Charlemagne baptized the Saxons, quote, by platoons, end quote. But no such wholesale conversions have since taken place in Africa, and the region where these exceptional scenes were witnessed has long since relapsed into heathenism. The American and West Indian Negroes, and the Negroes in European colonies in West and East Africa, accepted Christianity either by force of circumstances or through gratitude for deliverance from their enslavers. But very few free and independent men in Africa submit to the religion brought to them from Europe. Canon Taylor says it is too high for them. Perhaps this is true. It has been lifted above Christ by the complications of Europe, from gospel freeness and universality to theological dogmas and metaphysics. And, as I have just suggested, the progress of European commerce is making matters worse. The problem of introducing Christianity into Africa without the aid of independent colonies of Negroes from the Western Hemisphere, with the experience and discipline of the house of bondage, is impossible of solution. Well, now the question might occur, is there to be no foreign missionary work in Africa? If not, what is the meaning of the command, quote unquote, go ye into all the world, etc.? The meaning of God's word is often to be arrived at by the light of his providence. He has declared that, quote unquote, in Christ all the nations shall be blessed, that, quote unquote, he will give to him the heathen for his inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for his possession. This promise it is his purpose to carry out. But so far at least as Africa is concerned, not by the methods now cherished by the great missionary bodies in Europe and America. We cannot but entertain feelings of the deepest gratitude to the missionary societies and to the missionaries who have so nobly expended and are still expending their lives and treasure in a work in which they are following their very highest convictions of duty. But I think if they would study the two books which lie open before them, the Book of Revelation and the Book of Providence, they might be led to consider whether there are not other and more efficient agents who should be introduced to carry on the work. They have attempted to do and have succeeded in doing, in many respects, a magnificent work for God and humanity. They have poured out money like water and, quote unquote, have not counted their lives dear unto themselves. I hope that the African will never say a word or think a thought incompatible with the deepest gratitude and admiration for all the sacrifices and expenditures, all the sufferings and trials endured, all the good work accomplished by the band of self-denying men of all Christian denominations who have come and are still coming from Europe and America to evangelize Africa. But I repeat that all the experience of the past and all the experience of the present assures us that no widespread or permanent work can be done by these means. Nor is it any better with the secular agencies which are attempting to deal with the African problem. About 2 years ago, we heard of the extensive commercial enterprise in East Africa carried on by Germans, but the difficulties in the way of success seemed too great to be overcome by the money or men at command. We now hear nothing of that great effort. We have just witnessed the downfall of the quote-unquote province of Equatoria, over which for 13 years Emin Pasha presided, which cost so much money and of which such large expectations were entertained, pulled down by European hands. Quote, though I pitied Emin deeply, says Mr. Jeffson, for the disappointment he experienced at seeing his work of 13 years tumbling in ruins, I could never regret the downfall of the last of the Sudan provinces with its corrupt Egyptian rule. Note, Emin Pasha and the Rebellion at the Equator, etc. by A. J. Mountney Jeffson, London, 1890. End note. The King of the Belgians, with a heroic philanthropy, has gone on year after year, spending an enormous fortune in the endeavour to establish the Congo Free State. Recent intelligence informs us that that state is now on the eve of bankruptcy, its expenditure exceeding its income after allowing for the subsidies of the king by £25,000 a year. The operations of the Niger Company do not offer the most brilliant promise. The traders, scattered in factories along the coast, lead a gloomy and most forbidding existence, while turning over their goods at enormous profits in a trade between the sea coast and the interior. But as to any impression, good, bad, or indifferent, made upon the country beyond its margin, the descriptive word must be nil. Mr. Edward Dicey, in a recent number of the 19th Century, September 1890, after a serious and eloquent survey of the difficulties attending the efforts of Europeans in Central Africa, recommends to the English nation, quote unquote, a policy of masterly inactivity. This would indeed be a very simple, not to say cowardly, method of confronting the grave responsibilities which rest upon Europe with regard to Africa. The slave trade was begun by England in 1562, when Sir John Hawkins, one of the most renowned naval captains of his time, seized 300 slaves near Sierra Leone and sold them to the Spaniards in Haiti. In 1713 was concluded the famous Asiento contract, by which the trade was placed in the hands of a company of English merchants for 30 years. From this time, the share taken by Great Britain in the slave trade became greater than that of any other nation. The annual importation under the British flag amounted to 60,000 souls, and included 2/3 of the whole annual importation from Africa. The men who carried on this trade were sometimes good men, like the excellent John Newton, the author of the Olney Hymns, who was for several years commander of a slave ship, and who made more than 1 guinea voyage after his conversion. Sometimes, perhaps generally, the slave traders were demons in human form. They belonged to all the European nations. Their trade was carried on under providential control. An inscrutable providence allowed the Africans to be carried away for a twofold purpose: to assist in building up a home for the overflow of Europe, and for their own training and discipline. For 200 years he allowed the traffic, with all its horrors, to go on unchecked by any public protest, until near the close of the 18th century, a man was raised up to be the prophet of the law, to denounce the nefarious trade and lead to its abolition on the part of England and subsequently of other nations. It was on the 18th of April, 1791, that Mr. Wilberforce moved in the House of Commons for leave to bring in a bill to prevent the further importation of slaves into the West Indies. After years of conflict, the bill was passed, and the trade received from the British government the coup de grâce which led up to the abolition of slavery throughout the British dominions. God, knowing how he has made the climate, how impossible it is for foreigners to live here and introduce their improvements, and how strong the antagonism of race, provided for the deportation of large numbers of Africans to a distant land where, as in a severe school, they might be fitted for the work of building up and protecting their ancestral home. That educational training, intense in its almost fabulous bitterness, has lasted now for 300 years. End of section 1. Read by Faith Abíó-Ellison, London, 2025. Section 2 of The Return of the Exiles and the West African Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Return of the Exiles and the West African Church. A lecture delivered at the Breadfruit Schoolhouse, Lagos, West Africa, January 2nd, 1891, by Edward Wilmot Blyden. Part 2 of lecture. Now the time has come for the return of the exiles, and they are the only agency which, whether for religious or secular work, can effect any widespread changes for good. Providence demands restoration. Masterly inactivity is impossible. Quote unquote, Rachel weeps for her children and refuses to be comforted because they are not. Her cry is, quote unquote, give me back my children. The world at large seems as yet deaf to the wailings of the bereaved at home and to the cries for relief of the exiles beyond the sea. They have poured out thousands for the rescue from Africa. 2 individuals only who did not wish to be rescued, men who loved the people and the scenes amid which they lived and were devoted to the work in which they were engaged. The £20,000 spent for the rescue of Emin Pasha could have planted on this coast or in the interior a flourishing settlement of industrious Negro agriculturalists from the United States or the West Indies, who in a few years would have redeemed a large district for civilization and made important additions to the valuable articles of commerce. Surely, quote unquote, blood is thicker than water, and, quote unquote, to him that hath shall be given, even when he says, I do not want. But the final ground of judgment will be, quote unquote, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least, etc. In the mysterious work to be done in this mysterious land, we have 2 types of agencies thus far employed, both English. Sir John Hawkins, who represents the inauguration of the trade, or the despoiler, and Mr. William Wilberforce, who represents the extinguisher of the evil. Who shall represent the restorer? I may be allowed to say that the name of Maloney will in years to come be cited as that character. He is the only representative of Great Britain in official position who has announced it as a public policy to repatriate the exiles. He is the only British officer who has as yet practically recognised the gravity of the African situation and the grandeur and glory of the work of restoring to their country the long-lost exiles. In the annals of the future, Hawkins, Wilberforce, Maloney will stand for the 3 great facts or agencies in the work of African development. I must confess that I feel something of indignation as well as regret to be obliged to couple the two last names with the first. But in history, such incongruous associations sometimes occur. We have Jesus of Nazareth and Judas Iscariot. Their names are often mentioned together in the Gospel history. With regard to Lagos itself, there have been other governors who have done much and noble work for the improvement of the settlement. The name of John Hawley Glover will never be forgotten for his self-denying and important labours. It is interesting to see that a magnificent structure, now in course of erection, will soon adorn and beautify your city as a fitting memorial to his work and achievements. So in the history of West African governments, the names of Sir Charles McCarthy, Sir Arthur Kennedy, and Sir John Pope Hennessy will forever stand prominent. They, however, had predecessors in their line, but the place of the pioneer in any great movement must always be unique. Columbus discovered America. He will always occupy that unapproachable eminence. However, others may have utilised his discovery in a way far beyond his most enchanting dreams. Bishop Crowther must always stand first in the history of any native church, whatever form it may take. That name must forever be honourably identified with the history of West African Christianity. So, in the history of repatriation under British auspices, the name of Sir Alfred Maloney must lead the train of successors in that line that must come after him. Some, perhaps, to do in larger measure the work he has inaugurated. The time is now ripe for the return. The American Colonization Society has been for more than 2 generations pointing out the repatriation of the exiles as the only providential plan for Africa's regeneration, and sending home from time to time repatriates in small numbers. But the world generally, especially England, has not been ready for this work. Philanthropic and commercial associations still think that their methods for the regeneration of Africa are the most promising. But after a few more decades of exhaustive expenditure, the whole civilized world, secular and religious, will turn to the only heaven-ordained agency for the great work, viz., the Africans in exile. I must not omit to mention here and to put on record the expression of my admiration and gratitude for the important part which the British and African Steam Navigation Company and the African Steamship Company have taken in forwarding the work of repatriation. Indeed, those companies and their enterprising agents have done more within the last 40 years than any other single agency to promote and develop African civilization in all its most healthful phases, and to them Africans owe a great and inextinguishable debt. The SS Biafra left here a few days ago on her second voyage in the work of the restoration. It will send a thrill of deepest joy throughout the ranks of thousands of anxious and expectant Negroes in North America when they learn that steam communication has been established between West Africa and South America for the especial purpose of aiding the return of the exiles. And not only is there a preparation going on for this work in the hearts and minds of the exiles, but men of influence in England and America are being stirred up to take interest in the question. A copy of a letter was sent to me a few days ago, written by an English clergyman, Reverend Francis P. Fleming, LLD, FRGS, on the subject to G. W. Neville, Esquire, who has taken so active a part in bringing steam to the aid of would-be repatriates in Brazil. The letter is dated September 25 and is as follows, quote, that over 1 million of Negroes should be anxious to return to their native land and be prevented by poverty alone has so stirred my compassion that I have resolved to try at once and form an quote-unquote African Repatriation Relief Society for the purpose of collecting funds to give free and assisted passages to these poor creatures from Brazil's and Havana to Africa. I have already written to several friends who I hope will assist me, and I have laid the matter before Lord Salisbury and other authorities. I propose to form a society totally irrespective of all religions or political differences of opinion, and purely based on philanthropic principles to try and carry out this laudable object. I hope I do not overrate the generosity of Britain, but I cannot but believe that there are thousands who will be glad to help us. I propose returning to England next spring. Between this and then, I shall hope to have all afloat, and then I would undertake a crusade, holding meetings in all the large towns and manufacturing centres. End quote. It is hardly necessary for me to stop here to recount the advantages which would flow from the return of experienced agriculturalists and skilled mechanics, the influence they would exert upon the tribes in reconciling their differences, settling their wars as disinterested mediators and arbitrators, and the lessons they would impart in the various elements and appliances of civilized life. Imagine the result of 100,000 Negroes from America settled in the Yoruba country, with their knowledge of and practice in the use not only of the implements of peace, but of the instruments of war. What would become of the King of Dahomey, with his sanguinary customs and his murderous periodical raids? And what should we not witness in that glorious country as the result of a few years of uninterrupted peace? This is a work you must at once see that no other agency can accomplish. Our brethren, then, will return. What is the part of those of us who are at home? We are to prepare to welcome them, as I am glad to see you are already welcoming them, and make them feel the abounding and overflowing joy of the return. But I must now turn to another question of the day, viz. The native church. Events now transpiring have roused thinking minds among the Christian natives along the coast to establish a church of their own, so as to be able to deal with their own problems with which strangers cannot safely or profitably intermeddle. The present state of things must remind every thinking African who has been abroad of those notices on tickets sometimes issued by railway companies or exhibitions, quote unquote, good for this trip only, or quote unquote, not transferable. So, this present ecclesiastical arrangement, with its foreign props and supports, its foreign stimulus and restraints, might be labelled, quote unquote, good for this generation only. It can neither be transmitted nor transferred. We cannot transfer or transmit that which is alien to us, however by assiduous or protracted imitation it may seem to be ours. Quote unquote, from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he seemeth to have. The time will come, and not in any distant future, when our foreign patrons will withhold their patronage, remove the props which have supported us. Then, do you think our children will be able to maintain these alien and artificial arrangements? Will they care to keep up a complicated foreign system in which they have no extraneous assistance? Of course, in the new movement there will be among the more conservative here, as elsewhere, apprehensions as to the results of a change, how it will strike foreigners, how it will affect ourselves. Well, the fact is, we shall never learn to swim unless we venture into the water. Let us launch out into the deep and try the vast ocean of life with its sweeping gales and dashing waves. If our tiny bark should be battered by storms and we return to port with broken spars and tattered sails, we should be learning by experience. We should learn to be careful not to spread too wide a sail before we are sure of the strength of the gale. And what if we should founder? Many a gallant ship with able commander has suffered that fate. But we shall not founder if we are careful to take him into the ship with us, whose power can calm the boisterous sea and say to the raging waves, quote unquote, peace, be still. But to leave the figurative, I have not the slightest doubt that in forming an independent church, there will be at first much that is unsatisfactory. We shall probably be misgoverned. The work will be at times neglected. Our finances will be mismanaged. Some who watch on the walls may go to sleep when the hour demands unsleeping vigilance. But here again, we should be learning by experience. We might be often hampered by the thought of the clumsy and blundering figure we present to the world. We might be worried by the suspicion that our enemies are marking and recording all our shortcomings. We should be certain to go through a period of difficulties, of failures, when sympathy would be with our enemies, not with us. But we should be gaining patience and experience, and acquiring by labour, by trial, by suffering, by self-denial, a possession which we can transmit as our own to our children. We should also be able to recognise those who may be to blame for our misfortunes, and be able to deal with them as we have not the power to do now with delinquents and those whose defects and vices trouble the church and hinder her prosperity. But in this new enterprise we shall not be taking a leap altogether in the dark. There are lights and landmarks to encourage and stimulate us. Bishop Crowther and his able and persistent fellow workers on the Niger have laid the foundation of an African church and have inspired throughout the Christian world the belief and hope that such a church is possible. That institution of loftiest promise, the native pastorate, the apostolic fervour and zeal and abundant labours of your own James Johnson show you the possibilities of the native for indigenous and independent work. But while the church should be native, we do not mean that it should be local. We want to drop the conventional trammels of Europe, but we do not wish to localize religion. I mean to say that we do not wish to give it any tribal colouring or bias. We want to hold up the simple teaching of Christ and go out into the highways and hedges of our country and bring the people in, believing that there are those who are in earnest in their worship of God, needing only to have the way of salvation taught them more perfectly. The Christian world has not yet fully grasped the teachings, nor understood the example of him who was found not only among the doctors in the temple, but among publicans and sinners, eating and drinking with them, and who said, quote unquote, "Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and they shall become one flock, one shepherd." John 10, verse 16. Nor has the world yet reached the conviction of Peter, who, even after years of association with the great Master, continued to grope in darkness on the subject of God's universal love, until after that remarkable vision he stood before Cornelius, the Gentile centurion, and heard his words, quote unquote, "Of a truth," he then exclaimed, "I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted of him." The best and the most enlightened men in the Christian world today have caught something of the light which suddenly streamed upon Peter, and joining in the song of Longfellow, believe that in all ages every human heart is human, that in even savage bosoms there are longings, yearnings, strivings for the good they comprehend not, that the feeble hands and helpless, groping blindly in the darkness, touch God's right hand in that darkness, and are lifted up and strengthened. These longings, yearnings, strivings are more than mere human instinct. We must see in them the working of the divine spirit, and should not, by unsympathetic treatment, quench that spirit. We must seek to bring into the native church the chiefs and other men of influence. Do not expect of them the perfection which a narrow philanthropy exacts. Consider the conditions under which Europe received the gospel. Had the hard conditions now imposed upon African chiefs been required of European sovereigns and chiefs, Christianity might never have been permanently established on the west of the Bosphorus. The first Christian emperor, Constantine, was half a pagan to the end. He erected in his new capital, Constantinople, a statue of himself. At the base of this statue, it is said he placed a fragment of what he believed to be the true cross. In the same place, he deposited the Palladium, the cherished relic of pagan Rome, which Aeneas was said to have rescued from the flames of Troy, and which Constantine himself stealthily removed to his new capital. This was his fetish, brought over from heathenism. It was the same with his legislation. Thus we find, almost side by side, promulgated within 2 months of each other, 2 imperial decrees. The one enjoining that Sunday shall be set apart as a day of rest, the other providing that when the palace or any other public building is struck by lightning, the soothsayers shall be consulted as to the meaning of the prodigy according to ancient custom, and the answer reported to the emperor himself. Constantine was at one and the same time the summoner of the Nicene Council and the chief priest of heathenism. At one moment he was preaching sermons to his courtiers and discussing dogmas with his bishops, and at the next he was issuing orders for the regulation of some pagan ritual. Quote unquote, the same fountain, Bishop Lightfoot says, did send forth sweet waters and bitter. Note, Lightfoot's sermons. End note. If we knew more of the history of the Church in Europe, of the compromises that had to be effected before it could gain a footing there, we should be less exacting and more charitable to our brethren in the interior, whose condition is that of Europe in her primitive times. Not the least among the drawbacks in the influence of the agencies, secular and religious, which have operated on the coast, has been the persistent effort to ignore the peculiarities here of race and climate, to make a history for the people and get them to enact it. The endeavour has been to introduce social forces from abroad, to allow as little as possible to racial and traditional bias, or to individual genius, forgetting that these forces in Europe were a growth requiring time and not a sudden inspiration, not the work of a year or a generation. The consequence is just what ought to have been expected, viz., that whatever the cleverness or industry of these foreign teachers, quote unquote, the stars in their courses, fight against them, and no learning or money or valour can overcome these celestial antagonists. No, history in Africa is to be made as history everywhere else. You cannot reduce history to social formulas. The business of the foreign teacher is to impart principles which are of universal application, as all the teachings of Christ are, and to interfere as little as possible with the form they will take among the people. To pursue any other method is to rack or mutilate the poor objects of their teaching on the bed of Procrustes. What is essential is growth, not organisation. In one of your churches, a few Sabbaths ago, a foreign missionary called attention to the unsatisfactory state of things among the Christian natives, without, however, animadverting upon the crude and unphilosophical methods which have conduced to the unfruitful results. Institutions and customs are observed among the people which strike the foreigner as incongruous and ridiculous, because they are not due to any native or spontaneous development or even adaptation, but are rigid and slavish copies of what exists in Europe and America. As time goes on, the philanthropic spirit, which now seeks to reduce all races to a dead uniformity, will find out, under the deeper teachings of science, that if they could succeed in their enterprise, they would destroy elements of culture and of their own culture as a part of humanity, and possibly the most important elements of it, without whose full play humanity must always be lame and imperfect. The first principle of true growth is truthfulness. Now, imitation often produces outward conformity without any inward agreement. Truthfulness of character lies in what we are, not in what we appear or in what we say. A man may do an act or speak a word which agrees with certain facts, but himself may be false. Truth in the inward parts is the first necessity of growth. Simply outward conformity is pretense. Pretense is unreality, and unreality is barren. Pretense never has produced and never can produce any permanent result. The West African Church should be an African, not an English production. With Bible in hand, its framers should arrange for the suppression of whatever has hindered truthfulness in the people. The great incubus upon our development has been unreasoning imitation. This we must try to avoid. But do not run to the other extreme of avoiding what is foreign simply because it is foreign. There are many good things in foreign customs, many useful things, many precious things, not only conducive and helpful, but indispensable to a healthy Christian growth. These we must find out and cherish. We must have a church which will have the affection of the people and the reverence of generations, in which we may feel communion with all God's saints of old, at present and to come, so that with all his people we can embody in song, whether in English or Yoruba, in Igbo or Nupe, those beautiful sentiments sung always with grateful delight in all parts of the Christian world. I love thy church, O God, her walls before thee stand, dear as the apple of thine eye and graven on thy hand. For her my tears shall fall, for her my prayers ascend, to her my cares and toils be given, till toils and cares shall end. Beyond my highest joy I prize her heavenly ways, her sweet communion, solemn vows, her hymns of love and praise. In the establishment of your church or schools, there will be no danger of exciting jealousy or opposition on the part of the foreigner. Africa is not like India. It does not offer even the slender possibilities of life which India affords to Englishmen, and there are consequently, in connection with mission work on the part of Englishmen in Africa, no schemes of social or political aggrandizement. If there are any material fruits of mission work looked forward to, they are mainly commercial and industrial. The life, then, of the two races must ever be apart. There can never be any social or political identity. But you must expect opposition and even conflict. These are no sign or cause of weakness. Did you ever notice that when a bird flies against the wind, it flies with its feathers all gracefully smoothed down, and this enables it to sail aloft? When it flies with the wind, it flies with ruffled feathers, and hence it flaps about and cannot rise. West African Christianity has been too long sailing with the wind. Then, as Browning exhorts, then welcome each rebuff that turns earth's smoothness rough, each sting that bids nor sit nor stand, but go. God has given to every living creature, from the highest to the lowest, the means of defense and attack, showing that the intention of the Creator was that there should be war. Quote, "Blessed be the Lord, my strength," says David, "who teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight." End quote. Psalm 144, verse 10. No individual or race can give to another the results of its own struggles. The struggle in order to success is inevitable. The theory or system, then, by which one people seeks to transfer or communicate to another the results of its own endeavours and battles is far from wholesome. Therefore, what to us in the recent events on the Niger seems a strange and calamitous proceeding is in reality the unfolding of the mighty purpose of God for Africa, and his purposes, we know, are always wise and beneficent. It is the spirit of the years to come yearning to mix itself with life. End of section 2. Read by Faith Abíó, lá-Ellison, London, 2025. Section 3 of The Return of the Exiles and the West African Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Return of the Exiles and the West African Church. A lecture delivered at the Breadfruit Schoolhouse, Lagos, West Africa, January 2nd, 1891, by Edward Wilmot Blyden. Section 3. Appendix. Dr. Blyden arrived at Lagos December 20th, 1890, and on the 24th was waited on with an address by the committee of gentlemen who had invited him to visit the colony, viz., James Johnson, pastor of St. Paul's Church and member of the Legislative Council, J. S. Lee, merchant, R. B. Blaze, merchant, N. H. Williams, barrister at law, J. A. Otomba Payne, F.R.G.S., chief registrar, John Randall, M.B., C.M., J. A. Savage, merchant, T. A. King, druggist, J. O. George, agent, Radcliffe and Durrant, C. J. George, J. P., member of the Legislative Council, J. B. Williams, merchant, H. W. George, importer, Z. A. Williams, merchant, J. W. Cole, merchant. The address was read by the Honourable and Reverend J. Johnson. Reverend and dear Sir, as members of the committee whose invitation to visit Lagos you have so kindly accepted, and of the several professions of the Christian ministry, law, medicine, and commerce, we respectfully bid you a right hearty welcome to our shores. We have often heard and read with much real interest, pleasure, and thankfulness of your zealous and devoted labours on behalf of our common race, and of your desire and efforts to impress the Negro in exile in America and in European possessions on the coast with a strong and clear sense of his race, individuality, his close connection with and relations to the independent native states and their numerous inhabitants in the interior of Africa, his grave responsibility both in regard to himself and in regard to the whole country and people which his long residence in and connection with a foreign country and government as a subject, the loyalty he owes to it, his adoption and use of a foreign language, customs, and habits, and even his education, are apt to make him think little of, neglect, or forget. And the European, with a strong conviction of the great possibilities that lie before the Negro in Africa, and of his obligation to him to promote his return from exile to his fatherland, and fit him for work in it by an education that will not hamper or destroy, but tend to conserve his distinctiveness and confer on him true freedom, and by the simple teaching of Christianity, which is designed for and is so well fitted to promote a people's proper growth and true welfare for time and for eternity. We are thankful to notice that these labours have met with no small a measure of success at home and abroad, and that your late visit to America has greatly helped to diffuse or strengthen among the Negro population there a desire to expatriate themselves from the land of their former bondage and of their present doubtful freedom, and settle themselves in a country they can truly call their own. We rejoice over and are most thankful for the gifts and graces which our gracious God has endowed you with, the line of work which He has evidently marked out for you, the patience and perseverance you have manifested under difficulties and discouragements, not the least of which has often been the misapprehension of your aims and motives by your own people, and the facility with which many of them too often lend themselves to the ill will of those who, while they profess to be friends, are indeed enemies to the race, and over the fact that all you have been enabled to do has reflected no small credit and honour upon the race of which you are a member and representative. We hope and trust your visit to Lagos may serve as an object lesson to many a Negro, and especially the youthful Negro, teaching him how much he may do for himself in any sphere of life which it may please God to call him to occupy, contribute much to inspire in us and in our people generally a greater interest in ourselves as a people, a greater love for and devotion to our country, a greater desire to labour each one in his own measure to promote its advancement, and a more diligent, appreciative and thankful use of every suitable help which a beneficent providence may place in our way, and cause Lagos and the Yoruba country generally to be more widely known to our brethren in America, who are sighing for full freedom and desire to return to their fatherland, and whose fund of knowledge and experience may help much in building up our waste places and regenerating the country, and to the European there and elsewhere who may desire to forward their wish. Reply. Gentlemen, I cannot convey to you in words at the present moment the thoughts and feelings with which I am impressed. I thank you for your kind and generous utterances. My history has been a peculiar one. My experience has been somewhat diversified. I was born in the West Indies, but it has been my lot to travel in all parts of the world where Negroes exist in large numbers in civilized communities. I have seen them in the northern and southern portions of the United States, in South America, in Egypt, and various portions of the Turkish Empire. I have seen them under Christian and Mohammedan rule, but nowhere in Africa or out of it have I seen them existing under conditions more favourable to racial growth and development than in Lagos. I need not describe to you their condition in the United States. You have referred to it in your address. For purposes of comparison, I will come to the coast. Take Sierra Leone, which is the oldest of the civilized and Christian settlements on the coast, founded by philanthropists in the closing years of the last century, for the purpose of affording to the Negro not only a refuge from his persecutors in those slave-trading times, but a field for self-government and independent growth. But what has been the result? The exigencies of the situation have prevented anything like a normal development. The The civilized element which laid the foundation of the settlement were from America, from Nova Scotia, with views and feelings perverted in the house of bondage. Though of African extraction, they had lost complete sympathy with their people at home and lived separate from the Aborigines whom they found in the country. They were followed as settlers by the Maroons from Jamaica, who, embittered by contests with their masters in their insular home, had lived in armed isolation in the mountain fastnesses. They came to Africa soured and sensitive. They soon got into antagonism with their predecessors in the colony, and these two elements, though living without sympathy with each other, were both out of harmony with the Aborigines, whom they despised and treated with scorn as heathen and strangers, inferior and degraded. Then came a third element, the recaptives, who, coming from various parts of the continent, speaking a different language, increased the complications. For, landing in their distress and incapable of making themselves understood to the foreign settlers, they excited their aversion. This thing went on until in the course of time no fewer than 100 different African languages were heard in the streets of Freetown. It is easy to see that under such circumstances it was impossible for the people to have any common ideas or to develop such a thing as a public sentiment, or for any section of them to feel safe or to look forward to independence. These newcomers to the country were not only out of harmony among themselves, but were separate from the Aborigines. But still, it is interesting to know that notwithstanding these disadvantages, Sierra Leone has produced not a few able men who have achieved distinction and made an important impression upon the history of their race. But what might not have been done had not Sierra Leoneans found themselves living on an island? I mean, so far as each of its elements was concerned, they lived separate from each other in insular ignorance and indifference. The next settlement of civilized blacks on the coast is Liberia, which from a colony has grown into an independent republic. But this too has had its drawbacks. Its founders and their successors, in spite of themselves, brought from the countries of their exile the prejudices which had taken possession of them in that bitter school, and for many years of their history they did not understand how to take advantage of their heritage of race and blood in the land of their fathers. They are now beginning to understand and are striving to bring in the Aborigines to share with them their privileges and assist in building up a common home. When we come to Lagos, which is the youngest of the 3 Christian Negro settlements, we find a different state of things. The Christian Negroes who came hither, chiefly from Sierra Leone to settle, were members of the tribe into whose country they came. They had a common language and common traditions. They had not lived here as islanders, but as part of a great continent, surrounded by their own people and connected with the more distant interior tribes with whom they are in constant and unbroken intercourse. Since my arrival here and going about the town and seeing the close proximity and intimacy in which the Aborigines, pagans, Mohammedans and Christians live, I feel that it is impossible for the returned exile ever to lose sight of the rock whence he was hewn, or the hole of the pit whence he was digged. You are at home here, gentlemen, connected by tribe and language and instinct with the great mass of people around and beyond you. If anything happens to you from beyond the sea, you can fly not to strangers, but to your own people. This is an element of strength and a guarantee of independence which no other Christian Negro community possesses. I am glad, therefore, to have the privilege of visiting you, and I feel grateful to you for not only inviting me to visit you, but for providing the facilities to enable me to do so. This is one of the evidences of your self-reliance, independence, and practical interest in the work of the race, which will disprove the assertions in which our enemies are fond of indulging, that the African has no self-respect, no pride of race, no interest in the progress of his people. But nothing can be done before its time. We live in an age of vast movements. Humanity is everywhere restless, and attention is being directed to Africa by foreigners as never before. The honour you have done me in inviting me to visit you is not an isolated event. It is a link in the great chain of circumstances which are leading up to results for Africa, the nature of which no man can venture to predict. The Negro race in exile is everywhere restless. He is feeling after something which he believes is coming. You here in Lagos have been in great measure at ease. But Providence has recently roused you into thoughtfulness and anxiety. He has caused things to happen at your own doors and to your own brethren, which have startled you into thought and broken up your indifference. The events in connection with the mission on the Niger are providential. They have produced a profound impression all along the coast. Sierra Leone was, or is still, in a state of anxiety and expectation. Thinking men have come to the conclusion that the call of God has now become distinct and clear, that they should form an African church and take upon themselves the responsibility not only of supporting the gospel among themselves, but of extending it to the regions beyond. But they are looking to Lagos as possessing far greater advantages for indigenous and independent work of that kind, to take, if not the lead, at least a prominent part in such an organisation. The elements exist here in a greater degree for such a church than elsewhere on the coast. It is the only place where so many native Christians listen to the wonderful works of God in their own tongue, and where it would be so easy for them to be separate and distinct and have a church that shall not be composed of foreigners on the one hand who support it, and of parasites on the other who are supported. Under such circumstances, there can be no real or permanent growth, as is seen by the sudden collapse of the church on the Niger. Thanking you again, gentlemen, for your kindness in calling upon me today, I will conclude by saying that there is no other place in the world possessing like Lagos the advantages not only for indigenous, healthful, independent and permanent Christian work, but for the establishment of a civilization upon the basis of Negro idiosyncrasies. End of section 3. Read by Faith Abíó, lá-Ellison, London, 2025. End of the Return of the Exiles and the West African Church by Edward Wilmot Blyden.